last train to the fog, but no one believed me. The last train always found people who had nowhere else to be. I had told myself it was a convenience, cheaper fares, quieter seats. But there are habits that start because something else won't sleep. That night, the station was a bowl of cold light and breath. The neon sign looked tired enough to stop altogether. I stood by the stairwell with my satchel and a pocket watch that had belonged to someone I barely remembered. And the air smelled like the inside of a rolled-up map. Ink, rust, and a patience that had outlived its owners. When the train arrived, it did so without sound, a reluctant animal easing against the rails. Its paint flaked like old promises. Its windows held tired reflections, not faces. I had counted on a few regulars and the soft company of strangers, but the carriage breathed slow and empty. A thin conductor stood in the doorway, formal enough to be almost ceremonial. And when his eyes found mine, there was an unfocused quality, as if he were listening to a memory rather than to the platform around him. There was fog already, not the polite mist that visits parks, but a thick shawl that crept along the rail ties and pooled in the points. It swallowed the sound of the train's brakes like a hand over a mouth. The platform clock shivered above the ticket booth, neon ringed, the minute hand reluctant, and for a moment I thought I had misread it. Times do that in half sleep, they slide. Still, something about the way the fog kept its edge close to the metal made the whole station feel like a mouth waiting to close. I boarded because leaving seemed harder. The carriage smelled like old newspapers and the kind of polish that wants forgiveness. Seats were empty as tombs, covered in dust and small, precise impressions where people had once settled. I sat by a window and watched the platform shrink. The neon sign flickered to misread itself, letters blurring as if embarrassed. The conductor walked the aisle with slow, almost pedagogical motions, tapping a gloved finger against the ledger at his belt, as if correcting punctuation in a sentence no one else could read. The pocket watch was an accident. I found it wedged between seats, warm from someone's imagination. Its crystal was spidered with a small crack, and the hands were stopped at 3:17, which is the kind of detail that makes you half laugh and then keep your mouth shut. It felt heavier than its size, as if it carried a fever. When I opened it, instead of the precise tick you expect, there was a soft, oddly patient throbbing, less time than insistence. The carriage hummed around that small insistence, and then swallowed it again. There were other people, if you could call the Hayes people. A woman at the far end, whose reflection moved slightly out of step with herself. A man reading a paper, whose headline unmade into meaningless type when I leaned in. When I walked toward them, they stepped away, as if following marks only they could see. When I turned back, my seat was occupied by a print of someone's shoulder, and a scent that was not mine. The train carried on like a story told in a language I half recognized, and my pocket watch insisted the same minute. I tried to speak to the conductor. His nods were measured like punctuation, but when I asked about where the train went, he answered only by pointing. His finger described a slow arc toward the window, and then toward the fog, precise as a teacher correcting a margin. The ledger he carried was blank when I leaned to see, as though the ink had been devoured by the air. He tapped his glove against it, and then, more gently than a phrase deserves, asked me if I was all right. I said I wasn't sure anymore. The train left stations without lighting announcements, without the list of usual names. We moved through geography like a pen skimming the surface of paper, making lines, but never pressing down. Outside, the fog thickened until the world was only window glass and a wash of gray. Faces outside the glass unfocused into suggestion. Trees became soft pillars, and houses were mere suggestions of habit. Inside, the passengers behaved with small rituals, patting pockets, smoothing sleeves, glancing at the same stopped watch as if it were a hymn. My phone had no signal. The station app showed stations that didn't exist and times that refused to add up. I tried to tell someone, to ask if they had ever been told to stay, and the woman across from me blinked as if I had spoken in an accent she couldn't place. Her eyes slid past me to a point behind my shoulder, polite and exact. Every attempt to anchor conversation dissolved into polite confusion. And the more I insisted that the clock read wrong, the more they repeated their daily habits like a chorus that only half heard its director. We slowed toward a platform with no name I recognized. The lights there were dim bulbs in glass that didn't so much illuminate as declare the existence of a place. A platform clock hung like a concession, hands congealed at 3:17, its neon halo weak. The fog lay on those tracks like a sheet someone had failed to tuck. The conductor leaned out and gestured once, a patient, final arc. When I followed the motion with my eyes, the fog seemed to siphon sound, until even my breath sounded like a distant clock trying to remember what it had lost. I stepped onto the platform because the urge to prove something is stronger than the fear of being wrong. The ticket booth's glass was shuttered, and inside the ledger lay open to a page that had never been written. Fingerprints marked blank paper like punctuation. The smell of the place, stale tea, varnish, and the old man's aftershave was convincing enough that for a breath I believed I had misplaced my memory. My watch in my palm was warm then, as if it knew the platform's secret, and for a moment I felt less alone. And the platform shifted, not in the guttering way a light might fail, but in the subtle way a sentence rephrases itself and meaning slides. Letters on the neon sign rearranged into something that looked like my name if you squinted. The ledger's blankness gathered words that dissolved when I blinked. A cold pressure at the back of my skull made me turn. The conductor stood at the carriage door, still and patient, his glove pointing down the platform where the fog breathed like lungs. He wasn't telling me to get on. He was showing me a door I hadn't noticed existed all along. I thought about going back, of returning to the safe arithmetic of the train's interior, but not everything that offers escape is kinder. The seats I had left behind were rearranged, as if the carriage had been editing itself while I watched. A seat that had been empty now held the imprint of someone hunched and staring outward with a patience that made skin itch. Voices came like echoes of conversations past, delayed, answering questions I had not asked. The platform felt like a choice being offered slowly, courtesy of a conductor who taught people to step through things rather than over them. When I reached for the ledger to leave my name, any proof, my hand trembled. The page received my fingers like a palm welcomes a pressed flower, and for a second a line of ink appeared where I had rested, not letters, but the impression of a memory. I forced a laugh and wrote my station down with a borrowed pen. The letters sloped into a language I half recognized. I could feel the station reframe itself to accept what I had placed in it. The watch pulsed in my fist, and the world preferred that beating to my words. I told them afterward, or thought I did. The conductor had a way of folding questions like origami and putting them into his pocket. "You were worried," he said once, as if reciting a line I had rehearsed. No one else remembered the station's name or the time. On the network, it was a blank stretch of track, a maintenance line with no public stops. Friends shrugged when I mentioned fog in tones that suggested weather apps, not thresholds. The watch sat heavy in my jacket, stubborn and private, and I began to suspect that what had happened was not something you checked a map for. I walked the platform once more before I left and found that the ticket booth's glass reflected a face older than mine and not mine at all. When I held the watch up to it, the cracked crystal framed the clock in the glass, and for a blink the hands matched. Then they slipped apart, and the reflection smiled in a way that belonged to someone who had made peace with being not believed. I touched the glass and left a fingerprint that felt like a promise and an accusation at once. The fog pulled at the edges of the platform, like a tide coming in slow and polite. I don't know when belief turns into history. By the time the next daylight came, it was easier to tell myself rational stories. A dream, fatigue, a trick of motion. Yet sometimes at 3 in the morning, my hands twitch toward a stopped face of brass, and there is a patience under my skin. I keep the watch folded in my palm at times, feeling its odd heartbeat. If you ask me whether I left the train or the train left me, whether the fog swallowed a man whole or only deferred his answers, I will smile and turn the watch over and over. No one believed me. Perhaps that is the point.